Kia ora koutou, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to this virtual session. We plan to have an in-depth kōrero on how zero carbon transition will unfold from here. I'm Michelle McCormick, Policy Director at Infrastructure New Zealand. Our purpose is to advance best practice in development of world-class infrastructure for all New Zealanders. We do this through research, advocacy and public and private sector collaboration. It seems incredibly timely that we're here to discuss again climate change and its impacts. Right now, we're in a national state of emergency with many parts of the country being battered by heavy rains, high winds and flooding from Cyclone Gabrielle. This week's extreme weather has come hot on the heels of severe flooding in Auckland caused by what only a few years ago would have been described as a once-in-a-100-year event. Now, as we know, these weather events are happening more frequently and with greater severity. In Friday's New Zealand Herald, there was a headline that stood out to me. It read, "Finally, Kiwis care about climate change. Are politicians prepared?" This article examined how last month's floods have forced climate change onto the agenda, and no politician in this country, or anywhere for that matter, can afford to ignore it any longer. On the night of the 27th of January, Auckland received an entire summer's worth of rain in 24 hours. Suburban streets were swamped, the airport flooded, water swept away bridges, buses and cars. It derailed trains, wrecked businesses and tore houses off their foundations. 4 people tragically lost their lives. Climate scientists have been predicting this for a long time. As our planet warms, it's known that the amount of energy and water in the atmosphere will rise, and this will increase the number and severity of extreme weather events. Climate change is now forcing itself into political discussions like never before. At Building Nations in November, we explored what New Zealand will look like in 2050. However, it's critical we now focus on what progress can be made in the short term and consider a goal that's just ahead of us, 2030. This current decade is critical if we're to turn the tide of emissions within cities and built environments and avoid the worst impacts of a warming planet. We need to prepare and anticipate this change if we're going to have a sustainable world to pass on to future generations. Now we've seen firsthand what climate change can do, we must compare what's in front of us, and our actions must be decisive and transformative. In today's webinar, we want to look at how zero carbon transition will unfold. Today, we'll talk about 3 options. First, the green road, a future characterised by New Zealand as a leader in transition to net zero emissions, where climate change is core priority for governments and climate programs are ambitious and aggressive. Secondly, a divided road where very little is done over the next decade, leading to an abrupt and chaotic transition complete with predicted societal division. And finally, no road, where New Zealand fails to take action and faces the worst effects of climate change. It's now my pleasure to introduce James Hughes, who is Climate and Resilience Specialist with Tonkin & Taylor. James will be facilitator today and will introduce you to the panel. Nā mai haere mai, tēnā koutou katoa. Over to you, James.
Kia ora, Michelle. Thanks for that introduction. Just let me get my screen sorted here. Kia ora tātou. E ngā mana, e ngā reo, raurangatira mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. As Michelle mentioned, my name's James Hughes. I lead our climate and resilience practice at Tonkin & Taylor, and we've got a great panel line up today with Lynn Carter, Alec Tang and Brad Olson. And I just wanted to begin with a few introductory comments. I'll be brief, and then we've got hopefully an engaging discussion around those topics that Michelle has introduced. So first of all, in welcoming everyone to this session, I first want to acknowledge the severity of the floods, and I'm hoping everyone on this call has been safe and their family and whānau are safe and well. And I know people are really struggling at this time, so our thoughts are with all those who have been affected. The current extreme flooding and coastal events that we've seen have brought our climate challenges into really stark relief, I think, and there's been obviously extended and widespread commentary on both the urgency of reducing emissions, both as a globe and nationally as New Zealand, but also in building resilience and adaptation. And much criticism has been levelled, I guess, at how we approach land use planning, and also the adequacy of our built environment and our drainage and stormwater infrastructure. As well, obviously, the slips and the land instability issues are very front of mind. We've also been reminded of the vulnerabilities and inequities within our communities, which means these types of events really impact those who are most marginalised. And that's something we want to cover as well today. Just to pick up on Michelle's comment, a colleague of mine, I think, and this hasn't been published, but estimated that in parts of Auckland, the event was actually nearer a 1 in 2,000 year event. So very, very extreme. So that's another part which we might tease out really is what can we do to events that are of this magnitude? And we've really got to think about the range of tools, I suppose, both in terms of building more resilience, but also how we respond and recover. And so there's a real backdrop of uncertainty, both in terms of how these extreme events will play out, but also how we transition, right? And how, what new policies will emerge that will drive change in New Zealand. And those are really unknown. And what will be our response? What will happen internationally, nationally, with our trading partners? So as businesses, as councils, as communities, we've got to grapple with this uncertainty and make some pretty strong decisions so we've got some certainty going forward. And that's both in terms of the backdrop of New Zealand being a small country, limited funding and economic base, I suppose, compared to the larger countries. And Brad will talk to that as well, I'm sure. Michelle introduced the 3 scenarios. I won't repeat them, but we want to focus our discussion today on this 3rd scenario that she mentioned. And this is really the no road scenario, given the pertinence of the conversation today. What if our transition really doesn't play out? And we end up with the worst effects of a warming planet, where the world might be 3-4 degrees warmer, and we get the types of events that we've seen over the last week more often and in more severity and frequency. And how do we build and adapt to that future? So with that in mind, I'm just briefly introduce our speakers. Alec Tang is a chartered environmentalist and fellow of the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment. He spent the bulk of his career developing and delivering innovative sustainability solutions across business, academia, and the public sector. And he currently works as Director of Sustainability at Kāinga Ora. Brad Olsen is Principal Economist and Director at Infometrics and one of New Zealand's leading economic commentators across TV, radio, and print media. You'll be familiar with Brad, and he's passionate about using economics to make better informed decisions and can he can communicate complex and detailed trends in a simple, relatable, and useful manner. And Dr. Lynn Carter. Dr. Lynn Carter joins us from the South Island today. She represents Kaitahu Kati Māmoe Waitaha Te Rapu Wai and is Chief Advisor Ngāi Tahu for the Chief Executive at Otago Regional Council. She's recently retired from Otago University, where her fields of teaching and research were climate change adaptation and Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous Māori development. Since her retirement, she's continued to represent her iwi Kaitahu within her tribal takiwā on a number of committees. And through this work, Lynn continues to have a keen interest in urban and semi-urban development from Kaitahu regional perspectives, particularly within the context of climate change adaptation. So thanks for bearing with us with those intros. And I'm going to begin the discussion with some questions that I'll throw to our panel. And Alec, I might go to you first. And in the context of the events that we've had, and many people are talking about our challenge in 2 parts. How do we deal with the future proofing and the resilience challenges in our new development areas that we're building? We're continuing to build homes all throughout our country and our larger cities, but also how do we deal with the massive challenge of our existing developments that are more well known to be in hazardous areas now? Over to you.
Kia ora, James. Tēnā koutou kua whakaroka mai, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Great to be here. Yeah, look, I think it's a really important question, and it's so easy for our attention just to be turned to the new, and often we think about new developments and where we're growing and how we're growing. But fundamentally, we have existing issues, existing challenges that have played out over the last a couple of weeks ago and now overnight. And we're hearing stories from Tairāwhiti, Gisborne. Well, we're not hearing stories is fundamentally one of the big concerns. So it is critical that we look at both for lots of reasons. One, because people are being impacted, and James, you talked about the inequities that are playing out, and those impacts that we're seeing are often in those most exposed, those least able to respond. So not doing anything about those current exposures is not tenable in my perspective. The second reason why we need to do this is those decisions that we're making about existing areas are going to obviously impact the new. So there are lots of different interventions that we could put in place. We could lift floor levels, we could put in buffers, we can do a whole bunch of stuff. And also we can think about retreat. But if we are looking at the retreat, the question then goes where? So the decisions that we're making about our existing urban environments or existing developments will have an impact on what we then go and build, or the adequacy of what we're looking to build. And then the third and final is there's obviously the lessons that we can learn from the retrofits and the developments and the challenges of complexity. And you've kind of touched upon complexity. You know, we as Kāinga Ora, you can imagine, have lots of assets, lots of sites and lots of different locations. There is not one answer to resolve this problem that will cover all of our properties. We need to look at exposure for one, vulnerability, and also things like service levels. So some of those physical interventions that we could put in place may avoid some of those physical impacts, but what does that mean for the people in those houses from a community perspective, from a lively perspective, from an accessibility? So it's really important that we don't just get drawn to only thinking about the new, that we actually do go down that route of actually dealing with some of this complexity of the existing developments that we have, and thinking about their resilience and thinking about trying to address some of those inequities as we go through that, which I think we might come back to. You're on mute, James.
Rookie error there, thank you. Thanks, Alec. I'll just draw Lynn into that conversation. Lynn, in terms of the inequities that that Alec's talking about and that are, you know, front of mind for many of us, and can you speak to that a little bit more from your perspective and having worked with communities around the Motu and particularly in Kaitahu? What are some of the challenges you know, obviously we've got the socioeconomic challenges, but there's also a challenge we spoke about the other day around sort of information and getting information to communities that are potentially more isolated or don't, you know, necessarily engage in the same communications that agencies and councils put out there. And your thoughts on that, Lynn?
Oh, kia ora, James. Yes, I've been thinking about this. I was having a look at Ngāi Tahu's Te Kounga Paparangi, which is our 88 action points to help with building resistance, promote sustainability and into the future. And it's very much future focused, but there are a number of things that are happening already. I think when we're talking about the education, Te Rūnanga o Ngāi Tahu are looking at providing means for marae, iwi or hapu whānau to develop future fit sustainability frameworks within their region so that they're regionally specific. Within that, there'll be risk profiles created so that areas that of, I guess, more requiring more rapid actions and also what may have already been started in the process of climate change impacts will be addressed first. And through that, in order to, I think education is a big part because a lot of people get confused with the amount of information that's out there. I mean, even with the recent flooding, there's been a number of different interpretations and perspectives of what's causing it and what part climate change is playing. So part of Te Kounga Paparangi is education, and it's about developing a suite of educational tools so that people can be more climate preparedness within their areas, and also starting on the track already of identifying and developing a sustainable practice, and including things like, I guess, and shoring up our food security. I know people talk a lot about flooding, sea level rise, those kinds of things, but food security is going to be a big issue as well. Our infrastructure around our marae and leading to our marae. We had that big case in Karatani where my marae is, where our water went out, and that's all being improved now. But a lot of our roading into our village is underwater, is at sea level already, and flooding around our river, often those roads get impassable. So thinking about what our infrastructure is going to look like in the future is also something that we need to consider. And I guess a lot of that comes down to not only making ourselves educated in what we do and understanding and having up-to-date information to our whānau in ways that they can understand, but also how we build our partnerships, not only with our existing partners, such as Otago Regional Council, Queenstown Lakes District Council, and my region anyway, but also with people like Te Waka Kotahi, particularly when it comes to what's happening with our infrastructure. So we can have all these ideas and all these plans, but to affect real behavioural change, we're going to need really strong leadership to drive it. And that's going to require other parties coming on board with strong and believing in a partnership with Ngāi Tahu in our area.
Yeah, no, some really interesting points there. Thanks, Lynn. And we could dive into that a little bit more perhaps later, particularly around, I think, the challenges of attachment and history in a certain place when those areas become really difficult to live in anymore, and how communities and whānau and hapu deal with potential conversations around retreat. But let's come to that. And before I move on, I just want to remind people, if you want to add any questions, there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So please post any questions you've got there, and we can try and respond to them. Brad, look, we've covered, I guess, some issues around the scale and the challenges, and obviously in many people's minds, the cost is a real challenge. And you and I spoke the other day, and I threw out a guess that I said, I reckon this is going to be $500 million worth of damage. And you sort of said you'd done some back of the envelope calcs, and it wasn't far off. So have you done any work on that? Put any thoughts into the scale of damage? And then I guess by extension, how does a small country cope with the scale of events, and what are the implications, not only for I guess short-term financial implications, but longer-term repeated events and the sort of financial stability more broadly? Big question.
Well, I mean, these events are going to be some of the most expensive. It will be the most expensive sort of natural disasters outside the earthquakes that New Zealand will see. And I mean, the 500 million back of the envelope that you tossed out was pretty close to the 466, I think, that we came up with on the Saturday of the Auckland floods. Now, of course, all of the events of the last few days is new again. And to be fair, the cost of the price tag for the Auckland floods alone is probably closer to $1 billion, if you will, than $500 million. Just in terms of property and cars that we had assessed, was looking to be, I think, 450 million. You add in all of the uninsured stuff, you bring in all of the land slips, you bring in all of the actual network infrastructure, and there's a much bigger bill. I mean, even today, I can't tell you how difficult it was to hear or not hear from my family up in Northland over the last few days when they were cut off. No power, no internet, no mobile coverage, and similar. Northland's been whacked, parts of Auckland, Coromandel, the Waikato, even Taranaki. Hawke's Bay's off grid for possibly a week. That's I hate using the word unprecedented, but again, it seems to come back. And Tairāwhiti we haven't heard from. I remember when we were talking at Building Nations and the sort of question around cost came up. How do we afford the cost? And my answer at the time, and it remains true now, is how can we not afford it? I mean, look how much it's costing us already, billions of dollars that could have gone into a better area. I do think, and I mean, this was a conversation I think Lynn picked up before, that we often, when we're talking about this, there's a huge amount of information in the space, but sometimes that information is very negative. We talk about the doom and gloom, and I totally get that. But I think probably worthwhile noting as well that there has been, and we are taking steps, if you will, to do something better. Infrastructure spending over the last year has been revised upwards by 24% from what we originally thought it to be, and primarily that was because of higher and higher infrastructure spending by local government on water assets. So I mean, that's encouraging that we're starting to see some movements coming forward, but it's hugely expensive. It diverts resource at a time when we know that we're struggling to find the people and the materials to start with. Of course, it means that we're effectively having to pay over the top for the assets that we have, because there's got to be either huge amounts of redundancies, or when it breaks, we've got to then fix it and pay a lot more for that asset again. I do think there's a question over how we best try and address that financially about insurance, and how risk premiums are going to rise and how we pay for that. I guess the two concerns I have there is, one, there's a bunch of people that don't have insurance out there, or are underinsured, if you will. They're not really going to get much out of this. The other one is that, just from a pure market functioning point of view, I think we've sort of got the focus wrong in terms of how we decide on and discuss risk. If I'm going to take out an insurance policy, right, I'm taking that out for 1 year. And if I'm an insurer, I only know that I've got, that money coming from a person for 1 year until it's time to come up and readjust. If I'm a bank lending out a mortgage, I'm lending out that mortgage for 30 years generally. And so I think, there's actually a focus when it comes to financial stability. Doesn't need to be as much around insurance purely, but actually how that bigger lending comes through. The final point, and it goes back to that information, because I think, knowledge is power, and without that knowledge, you're going to be spending a lot, is also what we look at when we start to put some of these decisions together in terms of, like we were talking about before, land use and similar. When someone goes to buy a house at the moment, the first thing they look at is if it's in, the grammar zone or not. They look at the education decile or similar. I've never talked to anyone before that said, gosh, I had a look at those flood maps and it's not looking good. That sort of information isn't front of mind. And I do feel like, because it's sort of out of sight, it is very much out of mind. It's not considered. And it means that the risk allocation is broken. So it's hugely expensive. We don't even have a number for the current events. But the longer we leave it, the more expensive it becomes, and the more difficult it becomes to reallocate that risk properly.
Thanks, Brad. Yeah, very interesting points there. And just note, you are a bit glitchy there, so hopefully people did catch most of Brad's response. I just want to pick up on the infrastructure question that you're raising and the cost. So there's obviously the cost of recovery and the cost that's the losses that we're going to have to cover, which are both insured and uninsured. But then there's this sort of narrative around building more infrastructure. Now, like, I want to bring you back in around how much of this is an infrastructure problem versus how much of this is a land use problem, or is it a problem where we've actually got to think about living more with water and building our homes differently? And these aren't easy questions, and a lot's been said about sponge cities, and maybe Alec, you can talk a bit about that, water sensitive design. Would that have helped in this case? We don't know, given the scale of the event. But I think what is clear is we need to change some things. And yeah, interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I think they're good points. Before I go there, there's another bit to Brad's corridor that I think is really important to throw in there from a financing or funding of infrastructure, to think about what are the benefits we're getting out of infrastructure. And there are some like non-financial benefits, and there are some broader ecosystem benefits and flood prevention or risk prevention that I still think that we don't adequately factor in. So we're saying, it's more expensive to do X, Y, and Z, but we need to do that because these are all the other benefits that we get. So I think that's something that I would say just on the cost of infrastructure. In terms of sponge cities, water sensitive urban design, look, and I'm pretty sure that most people on this call will know that this is a term, green infrastructure, sponge cities. We've known about this. We've known that if we put a lot of concrete, if we put a lot of impervious surfaces over surfaces that have historically been free flowing, we're going to have issue, right? And that's not new. It's not rocket science. I 100% agree with you, James, that whilst that kind of water sensitive green infrastructure will have helped reduce the impacts, we may still have seen some significant impacts anyway. And I think that's why, particularly as a sector, as an infrastructure sector, we've got to recognize that our boundaries start to blur. So we can build and design infrastructure to manage certain loads and whatnot, but it's not going to always work, right? And that's why there's a requirement and a need to invest in more community infrastructure, stuff that Lynn, I know, talks about in terms of the response and how do we make sure the response is strong in the event that the things that we've built don't quite match up to the events that we see. The one thing I would say as well about sponge cities or green infrastructure or whatnot is that critical there is your land use, is your design, is to allow space for that infrastructure. So historically, we've managed stormwater by putting a pipe under the ground and it hasn't taken up any space. Now, when we think about sponge cities, or we think about putting in more impervious surface, that's going to take space on land, right? And we're going to have to think about that in a positive sense. You can think about it as, when it's not flooding, it's a great amenity. People use it as a park and whatnot. But actually, to enable us to do that green infrastructure, to enable the floodways that will flood, intentionally will flood, it means that the places that we do put concrete, that we do put properties, we're probably going to have to intensify more. We're probably going to have to put more there to allow for the space to do other stuff. And I think it's a nuance that is currently being lost in the swirl around, you know, should we be doing intensive buildings or not, or whatnot, is that we need to do it, but we need to do it well to allow us to manage some of these impacts in other parts of the really limited space. You look at those flood maps Brad's talking about, and it's all well and good saying, oh, we need to go further out. But, you know, you look at a map of New Zealand, and historically it was a big wetland. So when you're going further out, you're just embarking on, or you're hitting these other areas of flood. So I think there's a nuance and a complexity that obviously we have to kind of get through our current phase of what's going on. But I think we shouldn't have this kind of immediate response or nervous response in this immediacy post event to go, oh, but this must be the solution, because there's a nuance and a complexity that we need to make sure is accommodated as we kind of build our approach going forward.
Yeah, interesting points, Alec, both in terms of the challenges with intensification. And I think there's a narrative out there that, and we might come to this later, there's some questions in the chat around how do we balance the government's agenda, if you like, to put more housing in there in our cities, and is that fundamentally opposed to this and you know, more impervious areas? Does that go against managing and building resilience in urban areas, or can those things coexist? We might come back to that topic. I want to just pick up on this, and Brad, you mentioned it, that the insurance issues, we've had these massive impacts on where people live, and that's going to drive, I imagine, residents and property buyers and insurers and banks to look at those homes that are in higher ground or in more stable areas. And therefore, there's a risk, I think, that we're going to get those homes that have been flooded, that are potentially going to devalue, that the people who in lower socioeconomic communities are therefore only going to be able to be affording homes that might be in hazardous areas. And how are we going to manage this, I guess, flight from you know, to areas that are less hazardous, and the potential downside of that, which is, you know, we get more people living in hazardous areas who potentially don't have insurance and don't have the means. And Lynn, I'm keen to bring you into that. And you know, from I suppose the iwi Māori perspective, living in urban areas, what are your views on that, and how do we manage that issue?
Kia ora anō. Okay, so I suppose I could talk about some of the initiatives we've been working on with the various councils, the Regional Council and Queenstown Lakes District Council. We have relatively strong partnerships with them, and I'll talk that in line of partnership co-governance. And in terms of Queenstown Lakes District Council, we helped develop their spatial plan, which is currently being set up for operationalising. And it gave us an opportunity to be part of that decision making. And part of that spatial plan that sort of works hand in hand with their economic diversification plan. We all know Queenstown's reliant on tourism and with its inherent problems in terms of housing, etc., that brings. So within that economic diversification plan, it's been recognised that the mana whenua economy and culture is a really strong and, I guess, significant, well, it's been recognised as being a very strong, significant part of future economic development in Queenstown Lakes District region. In terms of the spatial plan itself, we've had a lot of input into the types of development that should be happening there. Okay, we didn't win every point, but and there's a number of developments that were already on the cards that are going ahead that I think will just exacerbate a lot of the problems that are in that area. But, that's my opinion, and being part of the steering committee, I've voiced that to them. But I think you're right. We need to start thinking, where is that balance between working with our land, working with our environment, and having to provide the housing and the infrastructures that are required in different areas. As Alex said, it's a very complex thing. There's no easy fix to it, but I'm sure if we think about it, in the past, there have been similar challenges for Māori hapu iwi in their own areas, and these have been overcome, and we often learn from how those decisions were made to overcome the challenges, and it might have required moving. And some of those things are alien really to the thinking of our whakapapa connections to areas. But if it requires that to continue, then there are big conversations that will be happening around how we can easily manage that retreat, if you like, from our coastal areas. And I'd just like to point out that in the past, pretty distant past, Māori didn't always build on the coastline, and I think we need to learn from that. Okay, it might be great to have a beachfront section in Pauanui, say, and I can remember when those early release of sections in Pauanui were released, and most of them washed away, and I think it went back 3 rows. And I think that should have been a lesson then, that that kind of area just isn't going to work long term. And a lot of Māori early settlements were on more elevated areas because of that. And I think we need to learn from those past mistakes as well. And in terms, I think I just read an interesting article this morning in the ODT about South Dunedin, which of course is a highly vulnerable site, and just some of the more innovative ways we could be thinking about working with the water, working with the environment that's been created there. It was a giant wetlands, perhaps part of it, like the racetrack, like the sports grounds, need to be returned to that wetland environment to help absorb a lot of that water that's going to be coming down, stormwater, etc. And there is an example of a partnership between Ngāti Toa and Wellington and Poriroi District Council, where they worked on the Elsdon Park wetland, and that was to create a permeable surface, if you like, a permeable space which would absorb stormwater and help protect the area from flooding, but also to protect the harbour from stormwater runoff. So there are innovative ideas already happening out there. And but as Alex said, it's very complex, and you can't just say, we'll do this and that'll happen, because there's going to be a number of other things that need to be balanced off as well. And could I just pick up briefly on something Brad talked about, and that is maybe being a bit more, or how we're actually going to reframe the way the Māori economy can be considered within the overall economic frameworks that are going to have to be put in place. And particularly its key drivers, the characteristics and values that underpin it, and to maybe be able to more fully understand how the Māori economy is working, so that those partnerships and co-governance structures can actually be more effective in helping wider New Zealand come to terms with some of the changes that are going to need to be made. Kia ora.
Thanks, Lynn. Look, some really interesting points there. I want to just pick up on some of the questions that have come through in the chat. So I might just scan through some of those. There's some really good ones in there. A question, and I'll just sort of open this up maybe to Alec first, and from Frederick. He's asked about, is there a plan for New Zealand to have updated design and construction standards for building and infrastructure? And if anyone's aware of this, and are they planning to be updated to take into account climate change impacts?
If I just jump on that, I think obviously Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, there are some changes to the building code that I'm aware of. They have they have been focused a bit on carbon. Obviously, that's been a big priority from our perspective, but definitely there is a need to think about the resilience side. But this goes back to the conversation we had with Brad, to go, if we're going to build more resilient homes, buildings, infrastructure, whatnot, that potentially have additional costs because you're either making sure it's green infrastructure, not concrete focused, that that have these. We need to recognize the value that we're getting from it, so that it doesn't just get value engineered out because it costs more, or we could do the solution and it's cheaper and we'll do that. And I think it's all well and good to have that that design standards, which I think is important, but we also need to recognize, and there were some other questions which we might get to about a more holistic view of the economy or economic settings and all that kind of stuff. I think is actually a fundamental question we need to ask about what are we valuing, how are we pricing things, and making sure that that it's not a superficial change, I suppose, is my plea, that we don't go, oh, we've had these storm events and we're just going to do X, Y, and Z, and we're not actually going to address that. We've come to this point where we have development in exposed areas where we're trying to chase our tail because we haven't tried to address those systemic issues of our economy, what we're valuing, what we historically have thought is the right place to build because it looks nice, versus actually what the natural environment says, hey, we shouldn't be here because it's a wetland and it's just going to continue flooding. So I think there's a bigger piece that I think we need to make sure we address. It goes back to that whole systemic change, not just a superficial change to how we're addressing construction, building, infrastructure, all those kinds of things.
Yeah, no, they point to broader societal norms and cultural changes that I think you're talking about at a systemic level. And maybe we'll just move to that question from Samuel, which he's interested in hearing the panel's thoughts on the current, whether the current economic system is equipped to adapt to climate change, and referencing Kate Raworth's donut economics work, Thomas Piketty's social democracy as better ways to promote sustainability over rent seeking. Are these realistic alternatives? And if not, what changes to our economic system could we make? And Brad, I might start with you. There's, I think there's a lot of perspectives on this from the different, probably economic and political spectrums about I'll just expand on this, on my sort of view of the spectrum from the donut economics and almost degrowth end of the spectrum, which is getting increasingly spoken about, versus, and this is my interpretation of it, the other end of the spectrum being we need sustained and enhanced economic growth to be able to afford the resilience challenges or the low carbon initiatives that the world provides. So you've got quite stark views on that. And Brad, I'll invite you to comment.
Yeah, look, it's a difficult one, and I think the answer there is that you sort of can't go to either of the extremes and rely on them purely to deliver you through. And I say that because I think the difficulty is that it's very easy to say that we should look at degrowth and that should be the major sort of focus. Who's not growing at that point? I think that then gets one to part of Piketty's conversation, but two, we've been talking about some of those distributional challenges and issues in that at the moment. Look, those who are best off in society, they've got the money to transit, ability to move to places that aren't flooding and similar, and I guess I just worry that it's good when you're in a good position to move and change and look at those opportunities. I don't know if it's as practical realistically to do that. Now I say that because I think a lot of it in my mind comes down to a lot more of the political system than the economic in a sense, because I'm not saying the economy is blameless, but I think we talk to one of the big things in economics at the moment is around behavior and around the expectations that you set. Now Lynn made a great point before about the Māori economy that I just wanted to weave into this, and that's one thing that we know about the Māori economy, in particular Māori businesses, is how far into the future they look. And I think that focus there means that you've got to have a much better handle on the changes that are coming down through the economy, that are coming through climate change and similar. So that's the area I think we need to focus more on. The worry at the moment is that, as important as people might see it to adapt to climate change and to worry about the future, if I'm a household that can't put food on the table tomorrow, I'm not worried about whether or not my house is drowning in 10 years. Now, I don't say that because, people don't care about climate change, but there is an immediacy effect that I think we've got to confront. Remembering as well that the government is telling us at the moment that they're happy to spend $2.1 billion to subsidise those people who want to drive the most and to ensure that we're still using more fossil fuels. So the messaging there, I think, is warped. Now, I say that because I do think that the political system has to take a lot more focus to allow us to move in these directions. And without those, I'm not sure that it's worthwhile almost conversing about degrowth, intensive growth. I think if we don't get the political settings right, then the market, if you will, is never going to function properly because it's being given the wrong signals. You're still on mute, James.
Sorry, thanks. Second time. A lot of people would probably love to unmute themselves and jump into this discussion right now, Brad, because it's I think top of mind for a lot of people on the call as well. I just want to acknowledge some of the other related questions that have come in, and I might just take this in that direction. And we have been focusing, largely on the infrastructure question and cities. And there have been people commenting on the broader impacts of climate change. So whether it's in regard to extreme events, temperature events, our agricultural systems, our food systems, our health and well-being, and also the systemic issues as well. And so, Lynn, I wanted to sort of bring you in there a little bit, and you did mention food systems earlier and say the extreme temperature type issues that we're going to have to deal with. And I wanted to, if you wanted to expand on that at all, and some work that you mentioned earlier.
Yes, and then just before I start on that, just picking up on what Brad said, and because it kind of ties in, and that is that money isn't the key driver in a Māori economy and in the iwi, and particularly not in Ngaitahu. Money's the means to the end, and the end is our future generations and what they're going to have to face. And so what we can leave for them in order to have that sustainable infrastructure, sustainable society, land, water, whatever, into the future. So the decisions we make today are always focused on what is that going to do for our future generations, and are we going to leave a strong platform there for them to be able to build on that into the future. And I guess that sort of comes back to food security, the water security. At the moment, we're working with Otago Regional Council on their Land and Water Regional Plan, and pushing very hard for our own ways of understanding, residual flow and all those other kinds of things that go with managing a water system, in terms of what the values of that water are to us and what is going to be there, and maintaining those values and that sustainable flow so that our future generations can also benefit. And it doesn't just benefit us, it benefits everybody else who has access to those waterways. So really, whatever benefits Māori is going to benefit down the line as well. Food sustainability, there's a big movement called Te Parakore, which is looking at going back to more traditional ways of understanding planting, of understanding crops and rotation. And I just read a really interesting paper on past Māori practices with pest control and what Māori used to do in terms of pests that came in and wiped out their kumara plantations and their cabbage tree plantations and various other mahiga kai, that kind of thing. And I think that's also going to be something that we need to look at, because it's not just about sea level rise, it's not just about warming temperatures, it's about all those other things that come with it, like extra type breeds or varieties of mosquitoes and things that bring disease that haven't been seen down here before, but possibly will be. And the various other viruses, and we've all just remembered the COVID ones that are still quite rampant. So we have to think about the overall picture, a more holistic way of considering what we're going to do, which makes it even more complex than what Alex was talking about, because you're not just considering an economic future, you're thinking of a social, cultural, environmental future as well, and how you're going to bring all those together. We've got a big marakai, a big garden for our marae, and a lot of marae have, and they're increasing that. We're also looking at ways of being better kaitiaki for our mahiga kai, particularly in our case, our paua and our other marine resources, because the waters are warming. Our kai might not want to live there anymore. So what do we do then? You know, so that has huge social issues as well. How do we manaaki people when we haven't got the kai that helps us stand out as having our mana whenua responsibilities in that area? So there are a number of really, really complex issues, but in terms of what I mentioned before, Ngāi Tahu's Te Kounga Paparangi plan, it's about looking at those and considering those complex issues and working out ways now that can form a platform for our generations in the future to develop upon.
Yes. Yeah.
James, can I just jump in? And I just want to jump in on something that Lynn's been talking about in terms of systems. And I'm going to share, and apologies, Michelle, I see you still. One of my biggest frustrations and is relevant to this call is the term infrastructure. Is that in having this discussion about infrastructure, we automatically think about, you know, discrete bits of kit, fundamentally, like the pipes or the roads or whatnot. And actually the conversation needs to be about those systems that Lynn's talked about, and what are the functioning systems that we need to thrive and survive. And they might be natural systems, they might be water systems. And the one that we haven't talked a lot about is the social systems that are critical for us as communities. And I think as an industry sector, or as a grouping of professionals, to move away from thinking, oh, like our focus is on infrastructure, so those pipes that are going to manage these flows or whatnot, to actually think about what are those broader systems that we need to nurture. And we can do that through an engineering solution or through a nature-based solution, but actually be quite broad and integrated about it. I think that is going to be, or it's going to have to be really critical. And think about the economics and the wide, when I say economics, I mean economics, well-being, not just the financials about it. And I think that's the challenge for the sector as we try and embark upon these kind of really complex issues of climate change, is to go, we're not just in our buckets, we're not just thinking about this one solution, we're thinking about how do we nurture a system that is resilient and that's low carbon, that takes out the carbon, but that is resilient, whether that's localized, whether that's you know, resilient from a supply chain perspective or weather perspective, that we need to do that in a more holistic way. And that's I guess the challenge that we see. And if we go back to Building Nations 2050, what does an infrastructure industry look like in 2050? It's one that does recognize more of a system role that it can play, needs to play, and has to bring a diversity of solutions to reflect the diversity of challenges that we face.
Really good points, and thanks, Alec. I think it's that multifunctionality and multiple benefits, and that you're talking about. And Brad's message saying, "Can I jump in after Alec, please?" So go, Brad.
I was just going to say, because I know there's a few questions in the Q&A that have come through about you know, the sorts of settings over do we go densification or not? You know, how does that work given the current issues? And just, I mean, Alec's point around systems, I think, is critical here, because with the greatest respect to all of those who are poo-pooing densification, I haven't seen umpteen dozen townhouses underwater, and I guess, you know, more importantly, it sort of I get worried that it has been a lot of conversations recently on the densification or not, and I think that's missed that sort of systems thinking, that if we've had a bunch of stuff that's already underwater even before some of these big changes have come through. So I don't think we can blame densification for places that have already gone underwater before the shifts come. More importantly, though, I guess it's one of those things where we do need to understand how we're best to plan our infrastructure. And if the market, I always get a little bit concerned and confused with people who look at the densification argument and say, oh, well, people might just put a bunch of townhouses, or they might densify a particular area that doesn't have enough infrastructure. And I think there are two important economic responses to that. One, if there's 5 dozen developers that jump into an area and say, I want to develop there and there's no infrastructure, well, then put some infrastructure in. because obviously there is, you know, a reason for that. You're not going to go and plonk one block of townhouses down and have swampland all around it. That would be a dumb economic position for the developer. But importantly as well, I think it suggests that there is that sort of induced demand element where either we start to plan properly for this, we put the right infrastructure around it, or we have what still seems to go on a little bit at the moment where we force stuff to not happen in lots of places. Therefore, it's almost like a bulging balloon that it has to spread into other areas. Lynn was talking about food security before. Again, if we you know, have to keep expanding, well, where are we going to grow our onions and potatoes? So I think there's wider flow-on effects here that say, actually, if we think that there's a need for resilience, if we think that there's a need for more infrastructure, I'd rather that we concentrate and plan on it rather than having to fix everything that's broken after the fact. So I just want to, you know, completely agree with Alex's point that we've got to plan for this. Either we plan for it or it makes us redo everything we've always thought about doing.
Really interesting points. And actually there's some, I was reading something the other day, which is parallel to this sentiment. If you think about the future of the large decisions that New Zealand's got to make, that we say around energy choices and energy mix for decarbonisation, it's whether we leave it to the market or whether we actually, the government comes in and we make a choice and we back a certain direction. And I think in the same applies, and most are saying you need to make a choice and move away from leaving it open because you provide that certainty. I think the same sentiment applies. And what you're talking about is it's those strong planning decisions, so we can have certainty and strong resilient outcomes. Lynn,
and because the market's not going to wait, right? I think that's the big thing. The market will not wait around for the next 36 years while the government or various planning agencies get a comprehensive, foolproof, 100% perfect plan. I think also, again, we need to make sure that perfect isn't the enemy of good. We've got to have a fair idea of where the direction is rather than waiting and then complaining when things go wrong because we didn't get it perfect the first time.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. I'm just scanning the comments. There's some really a lot of acknowledgement of what people are saying in the comments. Lynn, did you want to add to any of that, or shall I go to another question? I've just got a message saying you'd like to add something.
Oh, I unclicked, yes. It was really just to reiterate that it's going to take strong leadership, and I can't speak for other iwi, but certainly in Ngāi Tahu, we've got the strong leadership that has started developing ways that we can start at least putting some plans and actions in place. And we're not waiting for everybody else to come on board. We're doing it ourselves because we see the urgency, we see the need. We look at our landscapes and we see the changes that are occurring because of impacts of climate change on our natural environment. And our environment and our land to us is part of who we are. So it's humbling and it's distressing for people, particularly the older people, to see the changes that are occurring to our whakapapa. And so really, we're not waiting, we're starting to do things. And, we're happy for people to come on board with us. But, as I said, we've put forward this action plan, 8-point action plan, and there are a number of things in there that will help our own businesses reduce their emissions. The electric jet boats, of course, are the prime example. In terms of our agricultural interests, there are a number of initiatives happening there as well. But there's also about the social cost. And I think it's always been forgotten, that social cost. And so part of our initiatives under Te Kounga Paparangi are to build the resilience and the sustainability of our marae. And it's those marae that are the base of who we are, of the people. And from there, we can spread out and help our ones who need reconnecting in order to help them through the future challenges of climate change as well.
Can I, James, and there's a point that we, and I really want to make this because Brad made the point that, the market's not going to wait. Climate change is also not going to wait for us to come up with the perfect solution. And things will happen. And I suppose my big call is that we have talked about physical infrastructure. That's the social infrastructure, those marae that came as first responders, the community groups that we've seen in South Auckland that have rallied around. We need to make sure that they're not forgotten. The investment in those groups is critical because for all the investment in hard infrastructure, while things will fail, things won't work, and it's those communities are going to pick it up when it goes wrong. And I think we're unfortunately, or I'm sensing that the value of that, or the investment in those groups is being overshadowed a bit, and we need to make sure that we continue that, because they will become increasingly important as we see more and more events that we need to respond to. And I think it's so important that we make sure that that's not lost in the conversation.
Really good point. I mean, it reminds me of a resilience author I read, Dave Snowden, who says, things will continue to fail, and things will always fail. And resilience is more about early discovery and really efficient and fast recovery as best as possible from those events, and setting up those systems that enable that. And I think, if this was a 1 in 2,000 year event, there is not a lot that I would argue that infrastructure could do to improve an event of that scale. And then you rely more and more on your community networks and those systems to respond. I'm conscious of time. There are people who've asked really, really good, interesting questions. And I apologize to those we haven't got to. I think we've touched on some of them. What we might do is look at those and email out to those attendees who we haven't managed to get to your questions. Apologies to Glenn, Aria, Stephen, Justin, Jacob, Sarah, Catherine. I won't actually, everyone. There's a lot of people in there. So thank you for those. We probably needed another 2 hours. Look, I'm going to wrap up and then pass to Michelle to close. From my perspective, actually, I'll just go around the group really quickly for any last closing comments from Brad, Lynn, and then Alec. Brad, did you have any sort of closing comments you'd like to make?
Oh, I think, just given the sort of people that are on the call, I think just important to not lose sight of the ability for everyone to actually make a difference. You can help make that planning happen. You can move the levers yourself. You can convince people who have the levers to shift them in the right direction. Don't forget that power, because it either is used now or it goes to waste. Thanks, Brad. Lynn.
Oh, kia ora. Yes, I agree with what Brad just said, and also something that Tipene O'Regan said recently, which was, from adversity comes opportunity. And along the same lines as Brad's thinking, that's exactly right. Look for the opportunities that are going to help you, help whānau, help iwi, whoever, to actually be able to cope and have the mechanisms to cope with what's going to come. But also look at what are the opportunities they're going to do. What can you do that's going to make it better? And increase the decision-making power, the effectiveness of those decisions into the future. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Lynn. Alec.
Yeah, look, tautoko that. It reminds me that in the Building Nations, there was a poll about who has the biggest role to play in our sustainability climate response or something. And we've got to stop pointing fingers, right? It is contingent on all of us to play a role and a role that we can deliver. There was another question about, will these events of the last week or two finally click into people, responding? And it will only do that if we keep talking about this. Like, we have this real tendency to, something happens, big response, and then we've forgotten about it, or the next drought comes along and we stop talking about it. And I think it's really important that we don't, and that this will only be that trigger if we, the 200 odd people on this call, do exactly as Brad said. What's my role? How can I play a role? How do I influence my clients, my funders, whoever it is? If they're not having that conversation, we in this room need to make sure that conversation is had.
Thanks, Alec. A great way to finish. And look, I'd just like to close from my perspective on that note. It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you to the panelists for your time. We haven't got to all the questions, so I apologize for that. And thanks to all the attendees for joining in. Michelle, I will pass to you to close off. Thank you very much. Kia ora.
Ngā mihi nui, thanks so much for that. Robust discussions like today's is so important. We should see this as a great opportunity. Oops, I'm just getting weird messages here. We should see this as a great opportunity to be more deliberate in addressing the impacts of climate change and build greater resilience and sustainability in our communities. To close, I just want to note that the webinar has been recorded and will be made available on our website. Those that don't know already, Building Nations Conference will be held 7th and 8th of June this year in Christchurch. Keep an eye on our LinkedIn page to see when you can register and buy tickets. I hope you all enjoyed this session. Ngā mihi nui and many thanks to James and the panel members for today's kōrero. Please do stay safe and wherever you are, and mā te wā. Thanks.